Great. Hi, and welcome to our presentation on stone walls, links to human and woodland ecology. My name is Lisa Sawsville, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife. We're a statewide nonprofit that works to educate landowners and others on sound forest management and wildlife stewardship. Through our peer-to-peer network, we connect landowners to the land, wildlife, and to each other. If you'd like to learn more about our 3-day cooperator training, you can do so by visiting our website, which is www.vtcoverts.org. At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Robert Thorson, a professor at the University of Connecticut. His fascination with stone walls began in 1984 when he moved to New England, publishing his first book on the topic titled Stone by Stone, the Magnificent History in New England Stone Walls. So, Robert, go ahead and take it away.
Oh, good. Well, thanks. That's a nice, quick introduction. Pleasure to be here. I am on a timetable. I'm going to be leaving. I've got an alarm that's going to go off at 5 minutes before 1 o'clock so that I can make it out in time to an interview talk that we're doing in another room. And but I hope we'll be at Q&A by then. So I hope we have lots of opportunities. Lisa, thank you very much for the invite. I'm always happy to share what I have to share. I've been talking about stone walls for many years, and what I decided to do was throw together some some slides that matched the topic that you asked for. And so with that, I'm going to just share a screen, and I'm not quite sure who's in the audience, but looks like I got a few people here that I can see. So here I'm going to share a screen. And there it is. And have you got it yet, Lisa?
We do have it. It's just not in presenter mode yet.
I'm going to put it in presenter mode, and then I'll be able to click through it. All right. So there's presenter mode. And you can, I've got to move your little thing out of the way so it doesn't get in the way of my slides.
Oh, I think we have the wrong view.
Okay. You have presenter view. So I'm going to get out of here. Let's see. I'll get out of here. End show. Oh, and you're recording too. So I go to
I can cut it a little bit out.
Okay, I go to slideshow, and I'll just go to play from start. And I hope you get a better view that way.
Yep, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, now I got to figure out a way to minimize the screen. There, I'm out. I think I can't even see myself or anybody, but that's probably okay. So here we go. Links to human and woodland ecology. And let's just take a look at this first slide. I think you can see we've got a stone wall sitting there in vegetation. But let's go to the next one. I think I have to move it forward with there. Okay, now, what you may not have noticed on the cover is we've got 4 very different situations here in that simple picture of a cover slide. First, we have ferns on one side. I'm not quite sure why. And we have basically forbs and grasses on the other side. I'm not quite sure why, but I'm pretty sure that the wall has something to do with the difference between those two. Sometimes these are legacy projects, that are playing forward from some previous state. It may have been a cultivated field on one side or a hillside on the other. We don't know. Another thing is to look at the rock that the stone is made of. And I'd like to make a point here. Rock is the material and stone is the object. So you're looking at stones made of rock. But, we have that standard desert view. It's dry, it's lichen covered. Maybe there's a few mosses on it, but really only in the shady spots. It's fully exposed and very dry. And so locally, it's a desert. I mean, very locally, at the meter scale, it's a desert in an otherwise moist woodland. So that makes a big difference. And on the right, you'll see that the stone wall is made of pieces or grains. So it has pores wherever they don't fit together. And there's a labyrinth of interconnected passageways in almost every stone wall that certainly an ant could get through all of them. And things as large as a badger can sometimes get through parts of the wall. And so the wall is more than just a piece of the woodland scenery. It's a corridor for some creatures. It's a barrier for others. It's a blind that you can hide behind or away from or getting towards. There are surfaces on which you can live, and there are really 3 domains in every picture that has a stone wall in it that there would only be 1 domain there before. And the 3 domains are on the upside of the wall, You can have an uphill side and a downhill side, and that might gather material creeping down the slope. You can have a moist side and a dry side. You can have a windward side and a leeward side. You can have a snowdrift side and one that doesn't. You can have an eroding and a depositing side. So by having the wall there, you really partition one thing into three things. And I think that's true just about everywhere in any scenario. Now, truth in advertising, I always like to go to the website of the place that I've agreed to give a talk to. And this is it. And I'm indeed going to talk a little bit about human ecology, a little bit about woodland habitat. I am going to cover your stories or ask you for your stories, which was part of the bargain when I signed up. And then finally, some Q&A, hopefully towards the end. And I'll try and get through my slides so we can get there. I have a news update I'm very, very pleased to share with you. And that was just last week or so, the piece that I wrote for the Smithsonian on stone walls, a fairly large, freelance piece, almost 3,000 words, was picked as one of the best history writing of 2023, and that comes from a geologist. So I was quite surprised by that. This is from the History News Network. It's like a professional organization that keeps people up to date. So I'm glad about that. And now I'm going to, so I'm still in the game. Let me move forward one more. And then here's a piece from that article in the Smithsonian. And I really think this has a lot to say to Vermont versus New Hampshire versus New York versus Massachusetts. You know, we all think of our states as being so different, but the walls within them that thread across the state lines and up and down all of our lanes are more of a commonality. They're a common signature landform for the region, and they help bind the region together. I know that this is dangerous to say in Vermont, but I don't consider myself living in Connecticut. I consider myself living in New England. And the reason for that is that I moved here from Alaska. And when I did, I downsized 2 orders of magnitude from about 700,000 square miles to about 70,000 square miles. All of New England is smaller than my home state of Minnesota. All of New England is only 71,000 square miles. And Minnesota, which is not Texas, it's not Montana, it's certainly not Alaska. It's just a good sized state, is 84,000 square miles. And so when you take a geologist and you move them from Alaska to New England, it's very hard to get used to the scale of states here until you've lived here for 40 years, which I have. And I totally appreciate the cultural differences, between these states, but physiographically, they look more alike to me than anything else. And yes, I know that Vermont doesn't look the same as New Hampshire, but it looks more alike than, say, Indiana or Kansas. So it's all a matter of differences. So I have a talk here. I think one thing I really want to get across to you is that the stone wall is the signature landform of rural New England or interior New England. It's not a lobster pot, and it's not a lighthouse, but it's the defining element once you get in and away from the coast. And then I'm going to define a stone wall. It sounds kind of silly, but I'm gonna define it. And when I say silly, I mean I'm constantly getting requests for what is and what is not a wall, because even old historic towns that really care a lot, the inland wetlands group may not agree with what a stone wall is for the utilities group or the historical group. They may all see it differently, and believe it or not, there hasn't been a scientifically defensible or legally defensible definition of a stone wall that I was aware of that made sense to a scientist. Then we'll just dabble a little bit in stonewall science. Mostly what I'm going to do is just mention a few previous things that have come out in the last year or two for me. And I will be sure to send you some links if we haven't already got them. And then just some comment on human ecology. And by that, I mean, the walls are the result of humans just being animals or just being humans with an ecosystem in which they lived at the time. And then we'll get to the main part, I think, that might be of interest for the Coverts group, and that's woodland habitat. I'm just going to show you some pictures of stone walls and ask you to think about the habitats and the differences that they might be creating. And I'll draw a parallel to the wetlands. And then I'll hear some of your stories, and then we'll go to Q&A. So that's my basic plan. And when you see this beautiful quartz boulder, that's got some really interesting alteration colors on the inside of it, It just means we're leaving one part of the talk and going into another. Okay, so let's start with Euro settlement. This is Block Island on the southern edge. It's part of New England, and it is a very densely covered piece of stone wall. Now, we had, I think it was a dozen families or so arrived here in the late to mid 17th century, and within 100 years, they were burning peat because there wasn't any wood left to burn. And so I think this is just an example of the agro ecosystem of, you know, fields and farms and pastures and livestock that went in on New England, all over New England, you know, in a fairly rapid period of time. And if you were to take some estimates, it goes up to 240,000 miles of stone wall, and I'm guessing we have at least half of that left. And that comes from an actual agricultural census of fences that was done in 1871 and written up as a compendium. That's the best guess for how many stone walls we had in New England at that time, just about the time that half of them started to disappear. Okay, and then the result of that agricultural clearing, this is a LiDAR, a light imaging and ranging image that looks through the trees right here in our local backyard here in Yukon Forest. We live in a lovely rural part of northeastern Connecticut, and this is a continuous green forest. But if you use LiDAR to look through it, you can see all kinds of fields and pastures that from the top you can't see at all. So looking through the trees, this is what you see. And the residue of stone there, which is mostly walls, but it's also piles, it's also cairns, it's also monuments, it's also, you know, large erratic boulders, it's also foundations, it's a lot. I call the whole thing the stone domain. And I think much of the stone domain dates to a 100-year period, probably even a 50-year period. We don't have good numbers. I don't know that we'll ever get good numbers, but I think that roughly between the end of the American Revolution in 1775 and the Erie Canal in 1825, that's only a 50-year period, rounded off. And I think we probably had half of the walls went in that 50-year period, if not more than half. And I think if you extended it 25 years on either side from 1750 to 1850, you would probably, get 80% of them. Of course, there are walls as old as 1607. That's the oldest wall that I know of in New England, and that's up on the coast of Maine. And of course, walls are still being built today. But if you just looked at the sum total of linear miles or segments or volume or mass or whatever measure you want, my guess is that most of it dates to really a post-colonial 50-year period. Not all, of course. And these a typical view of stone walls around where I'm from. I've been all over Vermont looking at stone walls. I lived in Hanover, New Hampshire for a whole year, and I spent a lot of time just west of the river over in the Norwich, Vermont area. And I've talked up and down various Vermont towns over the years, and I drove it as part of a 20,000-mile tour to explore stone walls in 2004. So I'm pretty familiar with the walls that you have, and I don't have a whole lot of pictures of them right now, but we can get to that. So they're dominated by walls, and they're built by sort of hefted stones. They're not necessarily well laid. They tend to be thigh high. They're marking boundaries of some sort. And the reason that they are what I call signature landforms to the region is that in New England, settled New England, former agricultural New England, 40,000 square miles of New England. If you were to, if you don't see stone walls within a mile or two, you have to explain their absence. Everywhere else in the country, you will find stone walls in different places, but you have to explain their presence, not their absence. So they are a regionally distinctive signature landform of the region. Regional is important there. And there's a trinity of things that have to happen in order to get stone walls. And New England is the only place in the country to have all three of those things. Number one, you need to have hard rocks, not soft rocks. By this, I mean you need the gneisses and the granites and the schists, that are so common to the metamorphic terrain of the axis of New England. And if you start getting into shales and limestones and sandstones, the glacier can just easily crush these and pull them apart. Yes, there are sandstone walls. Yes, there are weak walls, walls made of weak rock, but they are not that common. The reason we have so many is that the glacier was not able to chew them up and grind them into a paste. So you ended up with sort of a lumpy glacier bottom. The second thing you need besides hard rocks is you need glacial bottom soils, by which I mean till. You know, this is the material that covers most of Vermont and much of New Hampshire. It's like the glacier is oozing and smearing and spreading and creeping over the landscape, and it's in contact with the rock below. And so that rock is incorporated, crushed, pulverized, and transported, you know, continuously for at least 7,000 years. And that's the stuff that the stone comes from, especially the top part, the melt out till. And the third thing you need is a landscape of fences. And I call it livestock tillage. Some people call it animal husbandry. Your Billings farm there is a good example of you know, sort of 19th century livestock tillage agriculture. In fact, some of my good quotes came from Esther Morn Swift, I think, who was the curator at the time at the Billings Farm Museum. And so you got to have these three things. If you take one out, you don't have the phenomena. If you take a hard rock out, you can still have the glacier bottom soils, and you can still have the fencing, field and fences culture like you do in upstate New York, but you're missing the stone walls. If you go from Fairfield County, Connecticut to New Jersey, you cross the boundary of the ice sheet, you lose the stone walls, even though the other two things are in place. And if you basically go from southern Maine, or in your case, Vermont, if you go all the way up into the highlands of northern Vermont, not in the lake country, parts of the Northeast Kingdom, you're basically going to lose your stone walls. And you lose them whenever you lose the farm tillage culture, because you're in a woods recreation culture. So that's really important. New England's the only place that has all three of these come together all at once. Now, a definition of stone wall. We'll just look at this. And I could ask you, is that a stone wall? And you would say, yes. And then I would say, well, why is it a stone wall? And then most people will say, because it is, you know, and you don't need a definition of a stone wall when you're looking at something this, because we have a common typology. But if you are trying to, you know, argue one side of a court case or the other, which is often the case, you need to know what is a long pile versus what is a short wall. And they're not, so I ended up reluctantly having 5 criteria really to define a wall. And you don't need to pull this out, you know, most of the time, because everybody knows what a wall is. But in the touchy cases where you're not sure what to call something in the stone domain, it needs to meet 5 criteria. And the first criteria is it has to be made of stone. And that could be natural stone, or it could be synthetic stone. I don't like to use the word artificial, but synthetic, I think you know what I mean. It's made of stone. And secondly, on the right, it has to be granular. You can't just have a big slab of rock, you know, laid down on edge like an extra long sill and call that a stone wall, because it's not granular. So for me, a stone wall is made of stones, i.e. it's made of fragments of the Earth's crust. And that should be self-evident for most people. But then let's go to continuity on the left there. A stone wall has to be a wall. It has to be a barrier. It has to be you know, like an obstacle. And the thing on the lower left is not a stone wall, because you can walk right through it. It's not continuous. But if you were to push the boulders against each other, you would have a stone wall. In fact, you'd have a kind that I call an abutting wall. So it's a wall, and it's a freestanding wall because it has 2 sides, and it's a abutting wall because it's made of only one piece, you know, below the level of the knee or something like that. Okay, so then elongation. The picture in the middle on the bottom, that's a really nice object. We've seen probably plenty of those in Vermont. That could even be in Vermont. I can't remember where I took it. But the problem with that, Karen, is it meets all of the criteria, but it's not long enough. You know, so we were not going to call that a stone wall for one reason and only one reason. You know, it's high enough, it's continuous, it's granular, it's got material, but it's not elongated. The ratio that I came up with after asking people is roughly 4 to 1. So if something's 4 times longer than it is wide, then you can call it a wall. And that's not something that I just, you know, pulled out of my hat. That was me asking questions of hundreds of other people. What is that a wall or is it not a wall? And 4 to 1 seemed to be about the cutoff point. And finally, on the right, height. That's not a stone wall because it's too low. You can just sort of step right over it. It's just like a line of cut stone. But if you were to have an object like a stone wall that is knee-high, or more, then you can call it a stone wall. So there's an arbitrary knee-high part to that. Or if you have stones resting on other stones, no matter how low it is, that counts as a wall to me. So we have 5 criteria. And the one on the left, which actually is in Vermont, fails only one criteria. It's not made of stone. And what that is, there was an auto junkyard. I can't remember exactly where it was. This is Colin Hardy's. Somebody gave me this picture. And what they did was they took all the dead tires from a colossal auto junkyard and they just moved them to the side because they weren't required to be gotten rid of. And there's, of course, a metal fence there, a cable metal fence. So that's waste products scuttled against a metal fence. And in the case of many New England walls, it's just waste stones scuttled against a wooden fence. But it's basically the same idea, except this one is not made of stone. And that's the only criteria it fails. It's elongated enough, it's high enough, right? It's continuous enough, and it's granular. The one on the right meets all of the 5 criteria, so it is a stone wall, even though you couldn't see it, from an airplane, because that's a shrubbery grown over the whole thing. What people are doing here is cutting back the ivy and the shrubs and the blackberry that has covered a former stone wall. So it's even a stone wall, even if it's invisible under the shrubbery, and that meets all of the criteria, so it is a stone wall. There we go. Now we know what we're talking about. We know what a stone wall is. Now, Stonewall science, for many, many years, stone walls have been, just sort of readily incorporated within history and, in literature and culture, and that's a whole nother lecture. This is just a lovely impressionist painting, from the Florence Griswold Museum down in Connecticut, but it could be just about anywhere in New England. To me, more of New England looks more like everywhere than it looks different. But we're trying to make a science out of it. And the taxonomy that I put together, or the classification or the definitions, is part of that science. Another big part of it is just trying to map them. New Hampshire has a stonewall mapping program that has got, I think, 7,000 miles of citizen science mapped stone walls now. And I think that's pretty cool. And I suspect it won't be long before Vermont catches up and does that sort of thing. But basically, these are the ground truth stone walls on a piece of property somewhere out in Western Connecticut. And now, stonewall science. Well, what the heck is that? And that's treating stone walls like they were normal, natural, landforms, like ledges, or like coastal dunes, or like inland wetlands, or like eskers, or any other diagnostic phenomenon. Just treat them as though it was an object. And I tried to do that in the NPR's Academic Minute. And it's kind of a misnomer. It's actually 2 minutes. They all are. But I think I would like to do is play this to you, because within just about a minute and a half, you'll be able to understand the whole story crammed into 1 minute. And I think it's worth listening to. So let's see if this works. And please confirm that it works when you hear it.
Stonewall is an important
Thank you.
landmark in the northeastern U.S. But what can they tell us? I'm Dr. Lynn Pascarella, president of the American Association of Colleges and Universities. And today on the Academic Minute, Robert Thorson, professor of earth sciences at the University of Connecticut, explores their history.
Crisscrossing rural New England is a lattice work of abandoned stone walls built mainly during a wave of agricultural settlement before the Civil War. Though hefted by human muscle, this extensive gridwork of stone was, at a deeper level, created naturally as an emergent phenomenon akin to mud cracks in geometry and anthills in mechanics. The human story began when the region's upland glacial terrain was cleared of old-growth forest to make room for pastures, fields, meadows, and orchards. Enhanced exposure to cold, wind, and runoff during the Little Ice Age gradually concentrated stone on the surface. Being in the way, it was scuttled outward to the edges of land parcels where it was dumped and often crudely stacked. Many of these linear landfills were then later upgraded into higher, better-built walls to maximize arable space, mark property boundaries, and replace rotting wood as a fencing material. When the agricultural economy went bust, tens of thousands of farms were abandoned and reclaimed by weedy trees, leaving an extensive network of hyper-concentrated stone beneath a 20th century woodland canopy. The cultural significance of New England stone walls has long been appreciated by the humanities. Now scientists are starting to take notice. To geologists, they are signature landforms created by a regionally unique trinity of hard crystalline bedrock, glacial soils, and the human agency. To archaeologists, they are artifacts that enrich a history otherwise told by documents. To ecologists, they are habitats, elevated volumes of dry, rocky terrain in an otherwise lower moisture organic world, hiding places, corridors, and edges. Each wall in the woods is a local dryland, the counterpart to a local wetland. Wetland science is robust. Dryland science is not. The time has come for greater parity.
That was Robert.
All right, so I'm not sure what you're looking at now, but I'll try and get out of this. And we're back. Are you back to the share screen NPR Academic Minute?
Yes.
Okay, good, good. Then we'll continue on. I've just published a piece. It's a mini monograph. It's called Taxonomy and Nomenclature and for the Stone Domain in New England, and it's from the main journal for the Archaeology of the Modern Era. And this is the source from which much of the science is emerging. And now we move ahead. I also recently published a piece in The Conversation, and Stonewall science is just, they really deserve a science of their own. They're at the intersection of everything else. And I may very well be looking into some habitat research down the road in the next year or so. And also my recommendations for how to define, manage, map, inventory, control, whether you're a land trust or a town government or a state park or any of that. I'm starting to get involved in the public process of Stonewall inventory and management in the same way that other professionals are involved in the inventory and management of wetlands. And I'm pushing that forward. This paper is accepted in the Public Historian. Not accepted yet, but I've got to tweak it before it meets the bar. But otherwise, it seems like a go. Now, the human ecology piece that I promised. This is my candidate for the most important wall, and that's the Old North Bridge in Concord. This wall could date to as old as the 1630s, and that's really, really old. All right, and it's just behind the Old Manse. And I think that one of the reasons this is so important is that this is the wall that Ralph Waldo Emerson looked over when he wrote Nature, publishing it in 1836. And that's really a turning point in the American view of the environmental consciousness. Another thing about human ecology that I want to bring up is a concept I call the Eastern cowboy. And when I moved to New England, I just couldn't believe all of the hyperbole about how stony everything was and how rugged everybody was and how the farmers worked their butts off to move the stone. And you'll hear this today, and much of it is true, all right? But the fact is the stoniness of New England, especially to an outsider, has always been exaggerated. And I believe that it was done so, to make the settlers more heroic than they would have otherwise have been, because they needed an enemy to fight against, in a land where the indigenous had disappeared essentially by disease, really, really early. Yes, they're still with us, but for centuries, they were in the backdrop of a very dominant, culture that just sort of took over New England. And the stone walls are a consequence of that, but they're not so much a heroic consequence to me as they are a natural consequence of what happened. And here's basically what happened. You can see in this scene, we have three basic kinds of land cover. We have the wooded hills in the back. This is in Lebanon, Connecticut, but it could be anywhere. Then you have, of course, the pasture or the meadow or the grazing land behind it. And then where the animals are actually cropped up, you have the stony surface that has concentrated stone through frost heave, through erosion, through animal trampling, through any number of processes that we could spend an hour on. All right, but the basic idea is the stone is associated with cleared land and exposure. Now, this is a really interesting slide. This is something I studied when I was in Alaska working, and they're called sorted circles or sorted polygons, depending on what their shape are. And what these have nothing to do with humans, but basically what happens is that in cold ground, there are circulating cells that will basically push stone upward and then outward towards the edge of a field. And where these cells intersect, you end up with polygons of stone. And it's not too much to think that something similar is going on a cleared horizontal space in New England where you bring the stone up to the surface, move it sideways where two fields intersect, they concentrate, and you end up with a concentration of stone. This has nothing to do with humans, all right? But the humans are also interested in having domains inside the fields that are less stone-free than their edges. Now, once it comes to the surface and is sorted, you need to figure out a way to get rid of it. And the best place to put stone is along a wooden fence line or on any kind of a boundary. And what I have in the upper left here are two pictures. One is from Petersham, Massachusetts, Harvard Forest. They mapped all of the stone walls in the 1930s. And the other one is just some sorted stone polygons in the Arctic, or polygons in the Arctic. And you can see that the overall pattern isn't that different. It's basically rectilinear. Another thing you can see in the slide just below that is our mud cracks. And mud cracks basically are dissipating a horizontal shrinkage stress, and they form a fractal progressive breaking up of the landscape. I think something similar happened to New England. The land isn't being broken up, but the stone is being concentrated along large fields and then subdivided fields and then subdivided fields. And so there's sort of a fractal development of the breakup or the shifting of stone around on the surface. On the upper right, we have an anthill on my former driveway right here in Storrs, Connecticut. And basically, however beautiful anthills are, however symmetrical, however nice they look, however interesting they are, they're just artifacts of the ant doing what it wants to do underground. These are disposal piles. These are radial, volcanic cone looking like radial piles. And I would argue on the lower right that much of the stone that ended up along our edges is just a consequence of the human agro ecosystem, people managing stone, with a least work concept in the same way that an ant is doing it. Now, of course, there are architectural walls. Here's the Great Wall in China. Of course, human territorialism is a big part of the human ecology. We all have private property, or we don't all have it. I don't mean we own it, but our whole land system is based on individual specific ownership of land. And so that needs to be defended and marked off. And that's a piece, but it's a piece that follows from, I've got a lot of stone, what am I going to do with it? And then the aesthetics is also a part. This is a jasper cryptocrystalline quartz in a volcanic rock here in central Connecticut. I mean, they could have put the red side in instead of the red side out, but the builder put the red side out because, of course, it's beautiful. So there's an ecological imperative in us for beauty, for ingenuity, for territorialism, and for, just getting by, putting waste somewhere else. And all of that is involved in the creation of stone walls. And finally, ingenuity. This is the mending wall at Robert Frost's farm. And it's the wall where he talks about you have to cast a spell to have the stones balance one on top of another. And human beings are incredibly clever, and that's part of our biological makeup. I mean, in fact, that's why we're so successful, is we're so clever. So we like challenges and we like doing things. So I can think of these 4 or 5 reasons why there's actually a human ecology associated with walls. It's not just about territory or ingenuity. It's mostly about, we need to manage a farm. We need to move stone and use it in certain ways. And that's a piece of it. Now, let me move on to the other part, woodland habitat. This is a picture of a bobcat that was taken by the video cam of my brother on the solstice. And it's in southern New Hampshire and Lee, New Hampshire. And I just decided to post it on the website of the Stonewall Initiative and share it for you. In the middle of the view, you're going to see a bobcat crawl up and use the wall as cover, like an ambush or looking a screen or a blind. And then he or she is going to climb on top of the wall and use it as a corridor. And it makes sense. It's elevated, it's quiet. You can see in both directions. And And it's just part of their normal hunting behavior. And so I thought I would just play this one. It's just 20 seconds long. And I'll point out in the mid when I can see the bobcat. There it is. It's moving in the middle, using the wall as a blind. Okay, that's that. Let me move ahead. Oh, that moved it ahead without me clicking the right button. So when you look at this, where's the habitat? Most of the habitat is not the stone wall because this is exposed. It's not in the woodland, so it's dry wherever you are. It's a roadside wall in Woodstock, Connecticut. And you can see at least 3 different kinds of habitat here. 4, actually. There's the water, there's the meadow, there's the woods, and let's not forget the wall. The wall is not merely an edge to those habitats, it's a habitat in and of itself. And here's just another example, a little bit less scenic, but just as important. That is a dry upland drained landscape above moist soils, and that won't change. And here's just another shot in the woods from where I am. It's a continuous corridor. And here it divides streams. You get the intersection. In fact, many wetlands are created by the building of walls across lower swales. And when that happens, you end up protecting the wetland, but not the wall that created the wetland. Here's a slide. I've shown you the one on the right earlier but here's a close-up of how different it is on opposite sides of a wall. And here's a lovely, painting. I forget exactly who painted it, but it's the cover of David Foster's book, Thoreau Country. And what I want you to see is that the walls tend to be missing to not very common up on the top of the glacially streamlined hills, so the so-called drumlins. And of course, they're not present down on the lowland alluvial or lake basins like you have in Vermont. Much of the Lake Champlain lowland, you don't have walls out in the middle of it because you don't have till at the surface. But when you do have the right material, you'll get a labyrinth or a warren or a crisscrossing pattern of stone walls, and they're zoned on the landscape in a really interesting way. That is, they provide certain kinds of habitat only in certain parts of the landscape. And now just some pictures. There's an open work porous, wall made almost entirely of quartzite boulders. That happens to be on the Montauk Point, Long Island, which I consider part of New England because it's the moraine of all the rest of the stuff built there. And then here's a fairly recent wall. One thing about wall habitat is wall chemistry. This slab on top of the fairly recent granite wall is got that brimfield schist material, that pyrrhotite, that metal sulfide, that iron sulfide that just decays rapidly, and it produces interesting geochemistry. And that'll likely influence habitat as well. All walls actually will look and taste a little bit different to a critter or a microbe. Here we have on the left a red bed wall. Very, very rare to have red sandstone walls in New England. I've only seen a few of them in my life that are natural farm walls as opposed to cut walls. And on the right in eastern Connecticut, just a typical wall. Normally a wall is associated with a barbed wire fence. On the left, we have more tabular shaped stones. They create a different kind of habitat, more like rock shelter habitat, when the big ones fall over, rather than just an open, porous, weird structure. And on the right, we have a fairly uniform mix of stone, and it creates a very porous, very regular look to it. And depending on what critter you are, or whether you're a milk snake, or whether you're a blanding turtle migrating along the edge of it, or a fox creeping along the top, or whether you're a lichen living on it, or a microbe, or an insect, or a monarch butterfly, warming up. I mean, these walls really are differentiated. They're not one thing. And here's a trial example. We're working on inventory and mapping. The idea here is that this is a classic LiDAR view of walls, but we're trying to map the taxon. In other words, what kind of wall? Is it freestanding? Is it a hybrid? Is it blocking? Is it the supporting wall? What kind of wall is it versus how high the wall is versus how well ordered the stones are? Are they stacked, or are they laid, or are they merely dumped? And so we're in the process of trying to to, make a science out of inventory. And this is something I wanted to share with you. I'm looking at my clock here. Yeah, I better quit here very soon. This is the quote from the EPA document on wetlands. Here, I better go find it again, wherever it went. There it is. Long regarded as wastelands, wetlands are now recognized as important features of the landscape that provide numerous beneficial services for people and for fish and for wildlife. Now, I was involved in some of the early wetland valuation and function. I totally understand wetlands. I've done a number of stratigraphic studies in their origins. Many of them are the result of human disturbance. They're not even so-called natural. But you could take this whole sentence and just cross out wetlands and put drylands, and with the exception of the word fish, the whole thing would apply. I argue and maintain that we have undervalued these as habitats. And I think somebody who studies coverts, is really going to understand that, because the covert is a sort of a deliberate habitat that you're creating, and the walls are coverts in their own way. Now, let's keep going so I can get to the Q&A. Yeah, the National Academies has a book on the characteristics and boundaries. I was involved in this work initially. And I've even written a paper on Edwin Wade Teal, who's a wonderful New England Pulitzer Prize winning nature writer, the first one. I've studied his wetlands and his walls, and how they go together. And here, of course, are the coastal marshes. You don't have those in Vermont, but they're all over New England, and half of them are pretty much gone. We've lost much of our wetlands, and we lost much of our stone walls too, because in the 1930s, many of them were turned into roads. I won't belabor that point, so I'll just move on. Your stories, that's a puppet that is of me, just to say that I'm going to quit and listen to your stories now, and I think I'm going to stop screen share and go to Q&A. So unshare, stop share. And now I'm back. Now I see a bunch of people. So I didn't hear a word from anybody, probably because you were all muted. I did my best to stay under time and to give enough, to cover enough subjects, and to make sure that I covered something that you signed up for. And so I hope you're okay with that. And now I'm happy to answer any question filtered through Lisa.
So go ahead and type them in the chat box if you have any questions or stories or thoughts. I grew up in Connecticut. I don't know, Robert, if I shared that, but my whole yard was surrounded by stone walls. One was, you could see where it delineated. It was an old farm, the hillside farm of Connecticut versus Vermont at the time. And it was fascinating. And I used to play up there all the time.
Sure, yeah. I wish more of that would happen today. Yeah, Connecticut is actually loaded with stone walls. In my book, Stone by Stone, there's an actual plot of the frequency of walls by state in 1871, and Rhode Island was the winner. And I think Connecticut came in second for that. And Massachusetts comes in third, not because it's less concentrated, but because it's a bigger state. Average the length in the state. So there you have it. But yeah, I really enjoy living in New England, and I feel like I'm in the county of Connecticut, in the state of New England. I know that my wife is from Maine, so she doesn't quite get it, but understands where I'm coming from.
So Terry types in, why do we have so many stone piles along with walls?
That's complicated. Let's just say that a pile is let's just say that a pile is one way of doing the same thing as a wall. The basic scenario is clear the land. The land produces stone. You have a problem, you need to do something with it. And most of the time, people began building piles of stone. And then when chance came, if chance came, you would move those piles to the edge of the field where they were less in the way. And for years, I mean, I hate leaf blowers, right? So I'm out there raking leaves in my yard. And what did I do? Any leaf within 20 feet of the edge, I would just rake right into the woods. I think most people understand that. And what would I do with the interior of the yard? I would rake leaves into pile, and then I would get a tarp and I'd haul the leaves, to the same place. And I'd get rid of them on the forest edge. And I think the same thing happened with stone. Now, in some cases, you'd have a wall built all the way around a property, and people just decide piles are fine. In other cases, you have slabs of rock or boulders that cannot be moved. And so that space that's preempted, you might as well pile stone on top of it. So there's a lot of reasons for that, but there is an association between piles. And there are some very rare, indigenous piles that are marking some sort of burials or some sort of commemoration at trail junctions and so forth. But by and large, the piles are just part of the same land clearing as the walls are, with the walls being a slightly, further step. I hope that's a decent answer.
That sounds good. So Tom wanted to know, what do we know about stone walls as fences for livestock? Some people see them and assume that that was their only purpose.
Yeah. Let's just put it this way. A stone wall can serve three functions easily, all at once, but they're separate needs. And you're going to get the best wall when all three of them align. Number one is you have to have a place to put stone, waste stone. And that has to be the number one, at least for most of the upland clearing. And that's not that debatable. But then secondly, but there are cases where you don't care how much stone is there. You actually go buy stone, to monument a boundary somewhere. So there is a need to mark a boundary. Although most of the time that's just, blazed trees or little monuments that you build, to mark lines or cut the brush along a line. So you can mark a boundary without building a stone wall, but you can certainly do a good job with a stone. And surveyors love them for that reason. And then a third reason is fencing. If you have enough stone, you can use it to replace the lower part of your wooden fence that was probably there to begin with. We often see a fence, with wood on top and stone underneath, and we say, oh, that's cool. They're taking a stone wall and extending the height. And historically, a lot of times what actually happened was you had a wooden fence and the stone was accumulating along the bottom and it replaced the lower part of the fence. I mean, there's exceptions to everything, but that's so now we have three functions, waste disposal, marking a boundary, and fencing. And most of the fences in New England are nowhere near the legal height of a fence boundary, especially for sheep. That was basically 4.5 feet high in most of the regions. That's the legal height of a fence. It's the standard equestrian board fence that you would see around an equestrian property. The 3-board white fence. That's the normal height of a fence throughout the colonial era. And even the early American era, right up to the 20th century. And I would say only one stone wall in 100 will make that height. But we tend to exaggerate and focus on the high ones or on the beautiful ones or the well-built ones, forgetting that the 99% of them aren't wall celebrities. We tend to just forget about the normal wall, which is thigh high, built with hefted stone, stacked, not laid, carefully laid. And it's kind of higgledy-piggledy, every 20 feet it changes a little bit. And it's not just a monumented single plan boundary. You can differentiate walls from different eras depending on the commitment. And finally, and not to be forgotten, is architecture and beauty and status. And, most walls have a folk art component in them. Just little decisions that are made to do certain things. So there's at least 4 functions. There's beauty, ornamentation, architecture, whatever you want to call it. So there's that aesthetic function, there's the fencing function, there's the boundary marker function, and then there's the stone disposal function. And I think every wall everywhere meets some combination of them. And a perfect example before I quit is a Rolex watch, which I don't have. But the idea is that you don't need $1,000 watch, to tell the time. But if you want to wear one, then it is a status symbol and a timekeeping device. Okay? But those
Okay.
two functions aren't self-exclusionary. All right?
Right. Let's see. Steve notes that he just finished reading Stone by Stone.
Oh,
He said it was fascinating.
good. Thank you, Steve.
He wonders what you think about our cairns. Were they by farmers, indigenous people, something else?
When you say cairns, you mean the cairns of stone?
Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
I'm saying it wrong. I apologize.
No, that's I think there's a Gaelic pronunciation like that. I think that there's a variety of reasons. I think almost certainly, it's inconceivable for me, to have indigenous people here for, 15,000 years and not have at least 1 or 2 cairns built, however many there are. Maybe it's 100, maybe it's 2. We don't know. We don't know the numbers. All right. We know that some have been investigated and proven to be associated with some radiocarbon dates that are old enough. Right. But the vast majority are like fancy piles, that are associated with other stone piles or with walls of some sort or another. And then, of course, when you're on hiking trails, you can just have a cairn that's spaced every certain distance. It's like rather than paint the trees on a hiking trail, you build a highland concentration of stone. Those are clearly just markers. And so but they're not that common. Volumetrically, they're not that common. And it's another case of us zooming in on stuff that's fascinating and curious. We zoom in on the 0.5%, and ignore the 99% that is just not that interesting. And we take a look at the end members, like the highest and grandest and ugliest, and the superlatives just sort of dominate our thinking. So and with all due respect, I think that human beings in general, whether they're indigenous or Euro-Americans or whatever, they love stone. And so they're going to do stuff with it. And it's not clear. There are very few cases where there are bona fide artifacts, sort of indigenous artifacts that are unambiguously associated with cairns on the landscape. And all I can say is it needs to be studied more. And there's more than one way of knowing something. I tell my students this all the time. Science is only one way of knowing something. And it answers the question, how do you know it? And it answers it by, I know it because I can prove it, right? And tradition is another way of knowing. And it just says, I know it because this is just the way it's always been done, and mysticism is another way of knowing that has nothing to do with science, or the aesthetic or the beautiful or the spiritual. And that's inaccessible to science. And it's just another way of knowing. And the last one is faith. I know it because I know it. There's just no argument anywhere. Well, I know this is involved, and I'm respectful of all sides of this.
Well, thank you. It's a great question that's next. Mike wants to know, should I maintain my stone walls?
Oh,
And if
great
yes,
question.
how should I maintain them?
Great question. And of course, I'm going to take the infinite number of possible responses and break it into just 2. Okay. And one is that if your stone wall is in the closed canopy forest, just on land somewhere away from roads and away from trails, I would just let it be. I would argue that stone is busy being a calendar or a clock. It's basically busy being archaeology. And there's something wonderful about watching a wall come apart at the millennial timescale, rather than at the decade timescale. To see what's going to happen, and because ultimately nature will take it over and reclaim it and bury all of the stones back again. That's what happened the first time. And so I would say let walls be archaeology. Do not strip mine them, if they're just away from roadsides and whatever. It just galls me that you need a permit to take a little bit of sand off your property, but you don't need a permit to go in and strip mine 26 acres of stone walls. That was a case in Lisbon, Connecticut that happened a few years ago that I got involved in, that was written up in a New York Times story. I mean, can you believe that? They're driving around with trucks saying, we buy stone walls. I get it. It's a business, people can do, it's a free country. They can do what they want, but you need a permit to haul a little sand off your land. And you have to leave the wetland intact, of course, because there's a whole army of people supervising that. But you can go in and strip mine all the dry land right off of it, because the regulations haven't caught up to what I think is valuable in the landscape. Now, the other kind of wall, if you have a wall that is on a roadside or on a driveway or in a town square or something like that, it's part of the architecture. I think that the person who built it would like you to maintain it. You would like set the stones back on if they fall down. And so that's the other part of the dichotomy, is that wall is busy being architecture. Let's maintain the architecture, and let's do it as non-invasively as we can. And whether that means you spray the whole roadside with Roundup, or whether it means you're going to go in and cull out the ivy or clear it every once in a while, or whatever you're going to do with it, I don't know. But I think that maintaining walls that are architecture is a good idea, because it honors the past. So both of those honors the past for different regions. And I hope that's, and then all the other walls fit into some kind of hybrid category of those two answers.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's see. Andrea said she was told that the stone walls on her property are of a standard plot size. She's not measured them, but is this something that helps determine what their purpose was?
I don't know what she means by standard plot size. I've heard lots of descriptions of walls, and I don't know what that means. But I think that what if you look at an early or pioneering style wall, you'll note that there is no standard. You know, every segment of the wall is a little bit different, and you'll surround a field in a way that looks like, you know, one teenager built 20 feet and a separate teenager built the other 20 feet. And so they're quite different. But when you start getting estate properties and the money comes from where you have an idea of what you want, or a format or a template for a wall, and then it tends to surround the whole field. And of course, if you're a utility like the Croton Reservoir, you have a specification for a stone wall, what it should look like, and then that wraps around the entire utility. So usually you don't see that standard organization, but there is a default average wall, which is a two-sided, freestanding, thigh-high, laid, field stone, usually single wall, but sometimes double wall. So there is a standard that shows up, but that's only statistical. I think I have time for one more question, and then I have to run off to observe a candidate, and I wish I had more time. But at least we got this
invite
far.
you back for more discussion, Thor.
At least we got this far, you know,
That's
to
right.
Q&A instead of me just holding forth.
Well, I love that, there's the ecology, around it, but there's also the human and the history. And so this question sort of pertains more to the history side. John says, it seems in our woods there are a number of incomplete wall starts. The
Yep.
folklore is that they were simply abandoned as farmers left after Civil War for better land.
Yeah.
Do we know the truth at all?
That sounds totally logical. It sounds like many stories. You know, we need to have, the world has to make sense. That's why we have conspiracy theories, so we invent stories. And yes, there's no question that you could go out and prove that if you were to document it and carefully and have a good hypothesis. You could probably work that out. And it's a totally reasonable scenario. There are false starts. There are walls that start and work their way out at the corners, but they never quite touch in the middle. I can just say there's all kinds of scenarios. I think it's quite common that walls are begun and quit before they finished. But that could be due to any circumstance. You could have a stroke. You could have to move away. It doesn't have to be the Civil War, even if that coincided. There's one thing, since we're in Vermont, there's this wonderful passage by John Steinbeck that hardly anybody knows about. And it's in the beginning of one of his worst books called To a God Unknown, but it starts with Uncle Ira, in Vermont. And here's this guy, and he's supposed to stick around and take care of the land. And he's just a dreamer. He wants to head west to California, not for gold, but, to open up new land. And so he walks away from the homestead farm, and just leaves it for good. And it's very poignant. I think he really understood that. And it's basically in Vermont. And then the rest of the book has nothing to do with that. But it's a great opener for the book. And so, yes, there are false starts. But let me just suggest, what if this was the opposite? What if you had a nice wall in the woods and somebody was using it as a quarry, for roadbed material? They would go in and they would carve off the wall, you see, and cart it away. So how do you know it's a wall that's a false start? It's not finished. Or how do you know it's a finished wall that's being carved up and mined for later use? Those are the kinds of things that a scientific approach to walls would be happy to dispense with all kinds of speculation and innuendo. It is answerable. You just have to learn to pay attention and be scientific about it. And that's why the walls themselves are a really good independent source of information. So I think we have three sources of information here. One is, what can you infer or induce, by making deductions about walls through hypothesis-driven science? Secondly, what can you learn by reading historic documents, because they're real? And the third is all the innuendo and theory and folklore and tradition that's really interesting, but hasn't ever been really tested. So with that, that sounds like a nice way to end this. So I will say, see you and thank you all for your questions. And if you email me, I'll be happy to try and answer them. And thank you for joining me. And Lisa, it's been a pleasure working with you. Okay? All
Thank
right.
you, Thor. Take care. Thank you
Yep.
all for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.